Right now, Russia is falling apart on every front. Fuel crisis, collapsing export and sanctions threatening through what's left of Putin's empire. Production has crashed, Belarus is bailing them out with gas, and now Turkey, one of Russia's biggest customers, is walking away. The Kremlin is panicking over US Tomahawk missiles for Ukraine. The skies are emptying as airlines lose plans and Europe is cutting Moscow off for good. Welcome to Ukraine Today. I'm Zoroslava Kolesnikova, and tonight we break down how Putin's war machine is burning out, one failure at a time. Russia's fuel crisis explodes, production down 10%, Belarus gas imports skyrocket. Russia's fuel crisis is spiraling out of control. According to Reuters, Belarus has gasoline exports to Russia nearly 49,000 tons in just 1 month. Meanwhile, Bloomberg reports that Russian fuel production has collapsed by almost 10% after precise Ukrainian drone strikes. Gas stations are running dry, regional limits are already in place, and the so-called energy superpower is burning out fast.
In Russia, the number of regions imposing restrictions on gasoline sales is growing. After the temporarily occupied Crimea and the Chelyabinsk region, Tyumen and Sverdlovsk have been added to the list. In Tyumen, the N1 gas station chain has set a limit of no more than 30 liters of 92 or 95 octane gasoline per person. And in the Sverdlovsk region, the situation is even more acute. At some gas stations, fuel has simply run out. Only diesel is left.
In short, the situation with gasoline isn't changing. There's no 90, no 95, not even 92. Basically, only diesel is available. I only have about 40 kilometers of range left, and that's it. So listen, there's no gasoline in Belgorod. That's the situation.
Already in Russia, people are saying, let's cancel the quality standards, let's make them more liberal. And Russian automotive blogs are already starting to joke that it might all end with gasoline being sold as 95 or 92 octane, but in reality, it will have a much lower octane rating, which will harm the engines and cars that use this fuel.
According to Novaya Izvestia, in October 2025, hundreds of gas stations in Russia may close. Owners do not want to sell fuel at a loss to themselves. The publication notes that at the height of the shortage, from July 28th to September 22nd, experts from OMT Consult monitored the operation of 17,000 gas stations and confirmed, at 360 of them, drivers are already being refused gasoline.
We do not expect such street protests. We will need to keep an eye on isolated outbreaks of discontent, probably around gas stations, the blocking of certain streets when people can't get fuel and will be demanding gasoline. Because, that's a very childish position. Everyone understands everything, but they'll beat their chests and say, what do we have to do with this? Give us gasoline. We loyally supported everything. We voted for everything, never went out, never protested. Why us? And this childish attitude will inevitably break through at some point.
To cope with the growing fuel shortage, the Kremlin sharply increased gasoline purchases from Belarus. In September 2025, imports of Belarusian fuel quadrupled compared to August, reaching 49,000 tons. Also, according to Reuters, 33,000 tons of diesel fuel were supplied from Belarus to the Russian market in just 1 month.
Russia is importing gasoline and from various regions, both in Asia, from China and other countries, and in Europe, including from Belarus. This is one of the results of Putin's war. The so-called gas station country is not selling but importing gasoline. These are the rightful results of the work of Ukraine's security service, our armed forces of Ukraine, our intelligence, and our Ukrainian weapons manufacturers.
The main reason for the fuel crisis in Russia is the precise strikes by Ukrainian drones on oil refineries. Since the beginning of August, at least 28 facilities have been hit, which, according to the Moscow Times, has brought fuel production down to multi-year lows. In October, oil processing at Russian refineries dropped to 4,860,000 barrels per day. This is 10% less than in July. Compared to October of last year, the decline was 5%, and relative to the pre-war year of 2021, it is already 14%. As a result, processing volumes have reached their lowest level in at least the past 5 years.
In October, the Antipinsky refinery in the Tyumen region, Slavneft Yaros in Yaroslavl, Rosneft's Tuapse refinery, Orsknefteogsyntes in the Orenburg region, as well as Kinev in the Leningrad region, came under attack. The latter was forced to shut down its main primary oil processing unit due to a fire, which accounted for 40% of its capacity. From a publication by the Moscow Times.
Strikes by the Ukrainian armed forces on Russian refineries have forced the Kremlin to increase oil shipments by sea. According to Bloomberg, over the past 4 weeks, shipping volumes have remained almost at their highest level in 16 months. But it seems that Russia will no longer be able to increase exports. The spare capacity of the ports is running out. The two main hubs, Primorsk in the Baltic region and Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, are operating at full capacity. The third port, Ust-Luga, could theoretically increase shipments, but since the beginning of the year, its figures are still below the peaks of October 2024. Meanwhile, the European Union is increasing the pressure. The 19th package of sanctions is being prepared, which, according to Bloomberg, will specifically target Russia's so-called shadow fleet. Moreover, EU ambassadors have agreed on a plan to completely phase out Russian gas and oil by 2028, despite the positions of Hungary and Slovakia, according to Reuters. Nikita Skoblikov for Freedom TV channel.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Kremlin in panic. Russia threatens US over Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Panic in the Kremlin. Moscow is losing its nerve. Russia's foreign ministry warned that the US must understand the consequences of giving Ukraine long-range Tomahawk missiles. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov called on Washington to act responsibly, but the message is clear: the Kremlin is scared. Why are these missiles such a nightmare for Putin, and what happens if Washington says yes? Full story ahead.
The subsonic American Tomahawk missiles are capable of striking targets at distances of up to 2,500 kilometers and are equipped with a warhead weighing about 450 kilograms. Their low-altitude flight and high accuracy make them the ideal weapon for hitting various types of military targets: airfields, command posts, and enemy air defense systems. The Tomahawk can both destroy targets and conduct reconnaissance. The missiles discussed during negotiations between the Ukrainian and American sides have variants with a range of 2,500 and 1,600 kilometers. In the first case, at least 1,945 Russian military facilities would be within their strike radius. In the second, at least 1,655. Ukraine will likely be able to undermine the actions of the Russian army at the front by targeting rear areas that supply it with weapons and support its offensive operations. For example, the plant in the Alabuga Special Economic Zone in Tatarstan could come under attack. Air bases may also become priority targets. 76 of them fall within the range of the longest-range Tomahawks, while 67 could be hit by those with a shorter range. According to the Moscow Times, strategic bombers take off from one of these bases, Engels 2 in the Saratov region, to launch cruise missiles at Ukraine. Recently, US President Donald Trump stated that he had almost made a decision to supply Tomahawks to Ukraine. But first, as the head of the White House said, he would like to find out how they will be used and which targets will be struck. The publication Axios, citing a source in the Ukrainian government, writes that Washington was concerned that the US would not be able to control the use of the missiles after they were handed over. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is trying to dissuade Trump from supplying Tomahawks to Kyiv. Dictator Putin uses various rhetoric, from supposedly friendly advice to outright intimidation. It should also be remembered that the Ukrainian armed forces are already striking targets deep behind enemy lines. However, Ukrainian drones are inferior to Tomahawk missiles and cannot carry such a warhead. On October 2nd, Putin issued a menacing warning to the United States about the inadmissibility of selling Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, stating that American military personnel would be forced to take direct part in Ukrainian strikes using Tomahawk missiles. Later, on October 5th, Putin threatened that the supply of Tomahawk missiles by the United States would destroy the emerging positive trends in US-Russian relations. The Institute for the Study of War still believes that the Kremlin is trying to portray the potential supply of Tomahawk missiles by the US to Ukraine as a dangerous escalation in order to deter the US from sending such weapons, the Institute for the Study of War writes. During his speech at the Valdai Economic Forum, dictator Putin commented several times on the topic of transferring Tomahawks to Kyiv. Among the main points, first, the Kremlin will respond to this. How? He did not specify. Second, the missiles will be shot down. With what? Unknown. Third, Putin assured that this would not affect the situation on the front line. He added that the supply of Tomahawks would mean a transition to a qualitatively new level of escalation.
But when the topic of Tomahawks is being pushed, it is a political signal, indeed a demonstration to Putin that, well, there is an opportunity to still move towards diplomacy. But so far, unfortunately, it appears that Vladimir Putin is not showing any real desire to move into a comprehensive process that would genuinely allow for a truly just and lasting peace to be achieved.
In the relevant committee of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, they admit that at the first stage, Kyiv may receive no more than a couple dozen missiles. After that, Washington will be guided by Moscow's reaction. If there is no reaction, the pressure will be increased. At each of these stages, Putin is given the opportunity to back down and enter into negotiations. And that is why the supply and use of missiles will most likely be very gradual. Yehor Cherniev, Deputy Chairman of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine Committee on National Security, Defense and Intelligence, in a comment to The Telegraph. In addition, earlier, the American newspaper The Wall Street Journal and the news agency Reuters reported that Washington had decided to provide Ukraine with intelligence for precision strikes on energy infrastructure facilities deep in the Russian rear. Undoubtedly, this will make it possible to organize more complex, high-quality operations, allowing us to penetrate air defense systems with fewer resources, let's say, without the need to launch a large number of weapons that would be intercepted. At the same time, Reuters clarifies that Washington has long been sharing intelligence with Kyiv. And the Wall Street Journal writes that, I quote, "The new developments will make it easier for Ukraine to strike oil refineries in order to deprive the Kremlin of revenue and oil." Larisa Petruk for Freedom TV channel.
Sanctions strike hard, Russia losing hundreds of planes and helicopters. Sanctions are finally hitting where it hurts, Russian skies. Russian airlines are preparing to lose hundreds of civilian planes and helicopters, according to the Federal Air Transport Agency. Just 2 years ago, there were over 2,000 aircraft. Now, 1,000 remain. Import substitution has completely failed. Spare parts are running out, and Russia's one proud aviation industry is crashing fast.
Sanctions and international isolation are grounding Russian civil aviation. In the coming years, companies may lose hundreds of foreign aircraft. Due to problems with repairs and the inability to purchase original parts, 58 planes have been taken out of service recently. And this is just the beginning, admit officials at Rostec. At least 200 of the remaining Western airliners operated by carriers which have been cut off from repairs and spare parts due to sanctions will have to be taken out of service by 2030 and replaced with domestic aircraft. According to the head of Rostec, nearly 30% of the Western civil aircraft fleet is at risk of being grounded within the next 5 years. It consists of approximately 700 Boeing and Airbus aircraft, which account for 90% of passenger air transportation in Russia, writes the Moscow Times on Telegram. Replacing these planes with domestic ones is no less a difficult task. The service life of Soviet aircraft is coming to an end. Creating new fleets is becoming increasingly difficult due to disrupted supply chains for components. And the high interest rate set by the central bank is holding back investment, writes Reuters. Thus, as of August, since the beginning of 2025, Russian aircraft manufacturers have delivered only 1 out of the 15 planned commercial aircraft.
Mainly, these will be withdrawn from the fleet. These are old Soviet aircraft, planes built in the Soviet era, such as the An-24, An-26, and Yak-40. The problem is not that they are being withdrawn. That's actually a good thing, because old planes that have reached the end of their service life, hopefully they won't keep extending it anymore. It's finally time to lay that stewardess to rest. But what will replace them? So the plan was that we would quickly organize everything in 3 days, and then everyone would want to be friends with us again. And well, everything would work itself out because purchases were being made. But now, frankly, there's nothing to replace them with.
The agency's publication reports that the number of fatalities in commercial aviation crashes in Russia since the beginning of 2025 has exceeded the total number of victims from such incidents over the previous 2 years combined. According to statistics from Rostransnadzor, in just part of 2025, 53 people have already died in 4 catastrophes. For comparison, in 2024 there were 17 aviation incidents with 37 fatalities. In response to the growing risks, the Federation's aviation authorities have planned inspections of regional air carriers. During these inspections, inspectors will need to determine the level of flight safety, the maintenance of aircraft airworthiness, as well as the training of specialists. The reason for these inspections was the crash of an Angara Airlines An-24 in July and the risk of a similar disaster happening again. According to Rostransnadzor, the number of aviation incidents in 2024 increased to 17, compared to 8 in 2023. And the number of fatalities rose to 37 compared to 12, according to the Moscow Times. The Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service reports that Russian airlines are increasingly resorting to cannibalization, transferring working parts from one aircraft to another in order to somehow keep their fleets operational. For example, the companies Volga, Dnieper and Aeroflot recently reached an agreement to transfer the last 8 Boeing aircraft. These planes will serve as donors for spare parts. At the beginning of 2022, Russia had approximately 1,500 to 1,800 Western-made civilian aircraft in operation. Today, that number has decreased several times over. The contract between the airlines Volga, Dnieper and Aeroflot is the first case in the Russian aviation market where a passenger airline acquires cargo aircraft solely for the purpose of dismantling them for parts. In the medium term, this will lead to a reduction in the aircraft fleet, an increase in transportation costs, and further degradation of Russian civil aviation. If the current conditions persist, by 2026 Russia's aircraft fleet could be reduced by more than half. From a statement on the website of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine. Let me remind you, about a year ago, Putin said that Russia needed to build its own airplanes and publicly gave corresponding instructions to state companies. He was referring to the passenger version of the light multi-purpose Baikal aircraft. However, not a single aircraft has been put into operation so far. Larisa Petruk for Freedom TV channel.
Russia losing Turkey. Another gas market slips away. Russia's gas empire is crumbling. According to Reuters, Turkey plans to boost its own gas production and increase imports from the US, aiming to cover more than half of its energy needs by 2028, cutting Moscow out of the deal. At the same time, Brussels is finalizing a plan to phase out Russian energy entirely ahead of the EU Energy Council on October 12. Another market gone, and Putin's energy weapon is losing power fast.
Turkey plans to increase its own gas production as well as develop alternative LNG supply channels from the United States and Algeria. According to preliminary estimates, domestic production and LNG imports under contracts will rise from 15 to 26 billion cubic meters annually starting in 2028, Reuters reports. Thus, Ankara will be able to meet half of its needs as early as 2028. This will deprive Russia and Iran of their main export market.
This will cover more than half of Turkey's gas needs, which amount to about 53 billion cubic meters, reducing the need for pipeline imports to roughly 26 billion cubic meters, significantly lower than the current contracted supply volume from Russia, Iran and Azerbaijan, which totals 41 billion cubic meters. To facilitate this transition, Turkey has signed several LNG supply agreements with U.S. suppliers totaling $43 billion, including a 20-year contract with Mercuria in September, according to Reuters.
It is worth noting that by the end of next year, the long-term contracts between Russia and Turkey for the annual supply of 22 billion cubic meters of gas will expire. These supplies are delivered via the Blue Stream and Turk Stream pipelines, while the contract with Iran for 10 billion cubic meters will expire as early as mid-2026.
Turkey's plans are quite ambitious. They have far-reaching prospects and their strategy is quite well thought out. First, to increase domestic production volumes. Second, to build domestic storage facilities, and they are moving in that direction as well. Over the past 10 years, their storage capacity has almost doubled, and they plan to increase it another 2.5 times over the next 4 years by the end of 2028. In other words, they want to become the third largest in Europe in terms of natural gas storage capacity.
Diversification of energy supply sources is one of Washington's main demands for NATO countries. For example, on September 25th, during a meeting at the White House, U.S. President Donald Trump insisted that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan reduce purchases from Russia. Meanwhile, the ambassadors of European Union countries approved a plan to phase out imports of Russian oil and gas by 2028. The goal is to deprive Moscow of an important source of revenue that helps finance Russia's war against Ukraine. The plan will be discussed in Brussels at the EU Energy Council meeting on October 20th. According to the program, starting January 1, 2026, the import of Russian gas under new contracts will be banned. As for short-term contracts, supplies will cease in June 2026, and for long-term contracts starting from January 2028. Under a binding contract, it is particularly worth noting that even Hungary, a historically staunch opponent of abandoning Russian energy resources, ultimately agreed to the comprehensive ban on Russian liquefied natural gas supplies to the entire European Union.
unfortunately for us, the volumes that can be transported are controlled by third countries, namely Turkey. Therefore, the volume of Russian gas reaching Europe has decreased by almost an order of magnitude if we compare it to the peak volumes of the 2010s and 2020s, when it reached almost 200 billion cubic meters per year. Now, at best, only a fraction is delivered by pipeline transport, around 15 to 16 billion. Europe is replacing Russian resources with gas from other sources. Norway, for example, continues to produce and supply gas tirelessly. The United States has significantly increased the volume of LNG it delivers to Europe, Qatar as well. And let's not forget about the volumes that were contracted by China.
In an attempt to retain its market, Russia has significantly increased oil discounts for India, Bloomberg reports. In November, the discount on Russian Urals oil was between $2 and $2.50 per barrel, whereas in August the discount was about $1. However, experts note that pressure from Washington on New Delhi could lead India to reduce its imports of Russian energy resources. Experts point out that Putin's main trump card, oil and gas, is losing its power. Soon there will be nothing left to fund a war of attrition against Ukraine. For example, Russia's oil revenues in September dropped by 20% compared to the previous year, according to Bloomberg. The government expects that oil and gas revenues to the budget in 2025 will be the lowest since the COVID-19 pandemic. And due to strikes by Ukrainian defense forces on Russian oil refineries, Moscow is now forced to buy gasoline from Belarus. For Freedom TV channel.
That's all for today on Ukraine Today. If you believe the truth must be louder than Kremlin lies, like, comment and subscribe. Want to stand with us on the front line of information? Become a sponsor and support our fight to expose Putin's failure and defend Ukrainians' voice. Stay strong, stay informed and stay with Ukraine.